Hi again. Welcome for another edition of the History of the American Musical. Today I want to talk to you primarily about Jerome Kern, one of the first and most important composers of the American musical, and also the composer of perhaps one of the most important and significant independent shows that we talk about in here, Showboat from 1927. I've often said that there are four major musicals that the entire history of this genre hinges upon, four turning points. They would be, of course, The Black Crook in 1865, the piece that we've talked about already, Showboat in 1927, also Oklahoma, which would come along in the 1940s, and Company, which would come along in the early 1970s. These four shows are really the signposts for this entire history. And with each of these pieces, a lot of things come out that change the game, that sort of make people think, okay, this is a new way of doing this art form. These are new rules, these are new styles. And a lot of other pieces come out that sort of follow that lead and are affected by that one groundbreaking piece. In the case of Kern, his piece is not the only thing that he's responsible for. We're going to talk a little bit about Jerome Kern's life in general. First of all, Kern, born in 1885 in New York, is one of the major, what we call Tin Pan Alley composers. I'll get to that, what that term means in just a few moments. Kern came from a fairly wealthy family. His mother taught him most of what he knew about music at a very early age, under 10. Once again, another child prodigy. And coming up into the music business, he began working for a company that we would call, as I said, a Tin Pan Alley publisher. Tin Pan Alley is the name that we give to a collection of New York City music publishers and songwriters that dominated popular music in the United States in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. You know how you go to New York City and there's, a meatpacking section, there's a fabric section, there's a garment district, there's a jewelry district. Well, there was a music district. It was called Tin Pan Alley. It was around West 28th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue, right in the middle of Manhattan. Understand that in this time period, in the late 19th century especially, the home piano was a major source of entertainment. Most homes had a piano, maybe an organ, and when one would gather the family together, they'd play off of sheet music, and the sale of sheet music was a big piece of the industry for music publishers in this time period. They would set up, tables outside of these major companies and sell copies of the sheet music for popular songs. Hopefully they would have as attractive and interesting a cover, a picture on the sheet music as possible, get your attention that way. This way sales could be charted on songs, much as they were later with recordings. And this way a lot of money could be made off of the idea of the song itself. The origins of the name Tin Pan Alley, there's a lot of folks who have different opinions about this. The legend, and it's starting to become just the accepted fact, the idea, seems to be that during this time period, predating air conditioning and everything else, folks would just throw open their windows and you'd hear people banging away at pianos near every window on this street. It would sound like lots of pots and pans being banged together, and hence the name Tin Pan Alley. Tin Pan Alley has come to be to also describe not only a time period of music, but a style, which we'll get into in a few minutes. A lot of songwriters in Tin Pan Alley would come to a large company and would be paid on an hourly basis, not per song, not based on whether the song was a big hit. If you worked for a particular company, you would clock in at 9 in the morning and you would sit at your piano and you would write songs all day, and any songs you came up with on the clock would belong to that company, and that company would be paying you as low as maybe a nickel an hour in the late 19th century, just to kind of crank out music. Kern got a job doing this at a very young age. He sort of faked his way in, claiming to be a little bit older than he actually was. And he wound up working for a company called Harms Music. T.B. Harms was one of the 8 major companies that pretty much ran all of music, especially as we get into the 19-teens, 1920s. The Tin Pan Alley companies consisted of a company called Consolidated Music Corporation, Irving Berlin Incorporated, lots about him in the near future, Leo Feist Incorporated, T.B. Harms, Shapiro and Bernstein, Waterston and Berlin and Snyder, and finally a company called Tams and Whitmark. And between these companies, pretty much those were the people who hired a lot of major American songwriters. In fact, they controlled about 80% of the business of published popular music until they were sued in a Sherman antitrust suit collectively against the group. Basically an anti-monopoly suit in hopes of breaking them up into smaller pieces. The lawsuit came out in 1920. But that's getting a little bit ahead of the story. Mr. Harms, Thomas B. Harms, auditioned our friend here, Jerome Kern, let him play a few songs and said, you're hired, you're somebody that we're gonna bring on board, and you just sit there and you crank out songs for us. And under their tutelage, ownership, whatever you want to call it, Jerome Kern wrote a lot of songs, including music for an entertainer named Al Jolson, music for the Follies, music for popular stage entertainments of the day. A lot of people would go to these companies, not just say, they weren't just cranking out music, popular songs for you and me, or for whoever the audiences would be. They were also writing songs for major theatrical productions. They were writing songs for vaudeville. They were writing songs for specific entertainers who wanted a hit song. And they would come to them and say, I'll pay you if you can come up with some kind of a project for me that would be worthwhile. So a lot of these Tin Pan Alley writers cranked out a lot of music, and in some cases they didn't see a lot of the money that they might have had they been an independent person, a contractor, and had they simply gone directly to the artist, because instead they were just paid hourly, but the Tin Pan Alley companies were making most of the money off of things like that. A big break for Jerome Kern, and an important one for us, comes from a woman named Elizabeth Marbury. Elizabeth Marbury is a really important and interesting figure in theater history. She's a pioneer in that, well, first of all, she was a literary agent, a producer, and in some cases a director, and a woman. And also that she was writing and producing independent, although albeit rather small, work. Elizabeth Marbury came from a pretty wealthy family, and many of her brothers, in fact she was the only girl, many of her brothers were lawyers, doctors, and when she went to her very wealthy dad and said, I want to do theater, I want my very own theater, well, he obliged her, and he bought her a theater, although he was not so generous or so crazy to buy a giant place like the Wang we know, or the Majestic, or the Radio City Music Hall. He bought her a relatively small building with enough space for a set, enough room for maybe 100 people to sit down and watch. And as a result, they called it the Princess Theater. And the shows that came out of it, the Princess Theater shows, out of necessity, developed something that's very, very important for this overall picture as we're putting it together. The shows had to be about character. They had to be about small situations, drawing rooms, individual casts of maybe 8 or 10 people. Those giant extravaganzas that you saw with the spectacle shows and that you saw with the operettas and even the Gilbert and Sullivan pieces, there's no room for anything like that. So Marbury, by nature, she's looking to create shows that have a cast of maybe 12 people. And she's looking for the emphasis to be on the characters and how they develop and how their relationships work and that sort of thing. She comes to Mr. Harms and she says, well, I need somebody to write music. I'd like some of these things to be musicals. And Mr. Harms says, well, I might have just the guy for you. He's kind of young, he's very industrious, he's willing to work cheap, and she introduces him to Jerome Kern. Kern winds up writing a bunch of these Princess Theater shows, and you probably have not heard of them. They don't have titles that are ringing off the ears these days. But nonetheless, they're very, very important because a number of other would-be future composers, including Irving Berlin and some other people, would admit to watching these Princess Theater shows, sometimes multiple times a week, and saying, I learned so much from watching somebody being forced to make a show about just individual characters and to make a show that's on a smaller scale. Kern would later return to writing for a larger scale, but when he did, he still took some of that style with him. He still managed to write a great big show, but still make it about characters with three-dimensional needs, who who weren't just stock cartoon characters. An awful lot of those shows, those operettas, the villain is the villain through and through. The hero is the hero. Many of them are designed to bring our romantic leads together at the end, and they live happily ever after. And that's sort of the style of that stuff. Kern would eventually take some of the things that he developed with Elizabeth Marbury's Princess Theater shows and turn them into something entirely different for the musical theater. Something extremely chancy and something really, really historically significant. It would be a piece called Showboat, and the second segment that we're going to get into in just a moment is going to be me telling you a little bit of the plot, a little bit of the story behind the production of Showboat and how it came to be. Before that, you might want to take a look. I'm also going to include a link, just a little bit of Jerome Kern's other musics and songs that he became famous for writing. And when you rejoin us here, you'll get the whole Showboat section in part 2 of this lecture tonight.